I shouldn't have heard that conversation. If I hadn't forgotten to mute my phone that day, if I hadn't been absent-mindedly staring at my computer screen filled with spreadsheets, maybe I wouldn't have accidentally learned this bitter truth. But the phone rang, and a familiar name appeared on the screen. Dad. A title that once carried warmth, but lately, it had become nothing more than a duty I had to respond to. I pressed the answer button. "Hi, Dad," I said, my voice calm. No response. I frowned, thinking the connection was faulty. But then, I heard the sound of a chair scraping against the floor, a heavy sigh, and then my father's deep, rough voice. "Not meant for me but for my mother. She's a failure, she will never amount to anything." My heart stopped, I froze, the phone still pressed tightly to my ear. My mother spoke, her voice lower but just as sharp. "At least she can take care of herself, right? She still pays her rent on time." My father let out a contemptuous laugh. "That's the least she can do after everything we've sacrificed. Do you think I'm proud of her? She shouldn't have been here in the first place. A mistake. A disappointment. A mistake. A disappointment." The words pierced through me like 1,000 tiny knives. My mouth went dry, my fingers tightening around the phone until my knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream, to hang up, to throw the phone across the room. But I couldn't. I could only sit there, motionless, listening to the insults from the man who had brought me into this world. "We'd been too kind, still letting her be part of this family." My father's voice continued, venomous and cruel. "I never understood why she keeps trying. She'll never be like us." I blinked, my hand trembled as the phone screen went dark. The call had ended. My father had no idea he had accidentally called me instead of hanging up. But that didn't matter anymore. What I had heard changed everything. For the past 5 years I had been silently sending money to help them keep this apartment. They thought they were paying rent to the landlord every month, but in reality, I had bought the ownership rights when they were on the verge of eviction. They had never read the documents carefully, they never knew the truth. And now I realized, even if they did, they wouldn't care. I had spent my entire life trying to prove myself to my father. I worked relentlessly, climbed the corporate ladder faster than anyone in my company, earned more money than he ever dreamed of. But in the end it was all meaningless. I would never be good enough in his eyes. But this was the moment that changed everything. I took a deep breath, steadying my shaking hands as I opened my laptop. In front of me was an important folder, the ownership documents for the apartment they lived in, payment contracts, agreement terms. My father thought I was a failure. Thought I was nothing. But he was about to find out who he had been depending on all these years. And in just 1 week, I would give him a surprise he would never forget. I couldn't sleep that night. My father's words replayed in my mind like a broken record. "She's a mistake, a disappointment." Each time I remembered, it felt like someone was squeezing the air out of my lungs. What had I been hoping for? That one day he would look at me and finally acknowledge that I wasn't useless? That all my efforts would mean something? How foolish. As soon as the sun rose, I got out of bed, made a strong cup of black coffee, and sat at my desk. The glow of my laptop screen illuminated my exhausted face as I opened the Everton Properties Darcy 4B folder, the code name for my parents' apartment. They thought they were paying rent to the original owner. But in reality, I was the one holding all the power. 4 years ago, when they were about to be evicted for missing payments, my mother had called me in desperation. "Isabella, your father doesn't want to ask you, but we're about to lose our home, can you help us?" I still remember how shaky her voice was. And of course, I helped. At the time, I didn't think twice. I simply wanted to make sure my parents had a place to live, so I contacted my lawyer, paid $125,000 to buy the mortgage from the previous owner through my company, Everton Holdings. The contract was simple. They continued paying rent each month as before, but now, the money was deposited directly into my company. They had never paid attention to that small detail. And maybe, they never cared. I took a sip of coffee, scrolling through the latest payment records. This month's rent was due 3 days ago. Yet, no payment had been made. Strange. My parents had never been more than a day late before. I checked their transaction history. Their bank balance was nearly depleted, They had about $2,500 left, while the rent was $3,800 per month. A chill ran down my spine. They were out of money. Not only that, I discovered they had taken out a $25,000 loan from a financial company 6 months ago, and they still hadn't paid it off, which meant they could no longer afford to pay rent. And yet, just a few hours ago, my father had the audacity to call me a failure. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. Before, if I had known my parents were struggling financially, I probably would have rushed to help without a second thought. But not this time. They had no idea that if they missed even a single rent payment, according to the contract terms, Everton Holdings would gain full ownership of the apartment, and they would become short-term tenants. If they continued to miss payments, I had the legal right to evict them. A part of me wanted to send the contract violation notice immediately. But I knew I had to wait. I needed to see if they would realize the truth. I wanted to see how they would react when they finally understood that the apartment they lived in no longer belonged to them. Suddenly my phone vibrated. A message from my mother appeared on the screen. "Mum, Isabella, are you free? Come home for dinner this Sunday. We all miss you." I stared at the message, a familiar feeling creeping into my mind. Every time they invited me over for dinner, there was always an ulterior motive. And I knew this time was no different. I typed a quick reply. "Me. Of course. I'll be there." A necessary lie. I set my phone down and closed my laptop. I knew this game all too well. But this time, I was the one holding all the cards. That evening I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my black coat. The face staring back at me was cold, composed, emotionless. I knew this dinner wasn't the warm family reunion my mother had texted me about. It was a trap. A performance. A setup. But I was no longer the naive daughter who believed in sweet words. I drove to my parents' apartment, the one they still thought belonged to them, but had actually been in my hands for the past 4 years. As I stepped onto the porch, the door opened before I could knock. My mother, Linda, stood there with a bright, artificial smile. "Isabella, you're home!" She hugged me, but there was no warmth in it, just a facade. I stepped inside. The apartment was the same, cozy, familiar, but tonight there was a suffocating tension in the air. My father, Greg, sat at the dining table with a glass of wine in front of him. His eyes were cold as he looked at me. It felt as if I was a stranger, someone who didn't belong here. Beside him, my brother, Ethan, the golden child, leaned back in his chair with his usual smug expression. I pulled out a chair, sat down, and placed my hands on the table. Waiting. They would get to the point soon enough. My mother started first, her voice unnaturally gentle. "How have you been, sweetheart? Work going well?" I took a sip of water, offering a faint smile. "Still good. What about you and Dad?" My father set his glass down, clearing his throat. "Actually, we're having a bit of financial trouble." There it was. The game had begun. I nodded, feigning concern. "Oh? What happened?" My mother sighed, reaching for my hand as if this were some tragic situation. "This month's rent. It's a bit difficult. We need some extra help. Do you think you could assist us?" I tilted my head, my gaze turning cold. "How much?" My father stared at me. "Just an extra $2,500 a month. That's nothing compared to what you make." I let out a quiet laugh. "I remember you once said I was a failure, didn't you? So why do you need money from me now?" The room fell into a dead silence. My mother withdrew her hand, flustered. Ethan scoffed, amused. "Oh, come on, Isabella. Don't act so self-righteous. Family is supposed to help each other." I met my father's eyes directly. Is family about helping each other, or about using each other? His hands clenched into fists. "Watch your mouth. If it weren't for us, you wouldn't be where you are today." I let out a slow, knowing smile. "Without you? Do you know who has been keeping this apartment for you these past 4 years?" Silence filled the room. "Everton Holdings," I continued, my voice dripping with mockery. "Does that name sound familiar?" My father narrowed his eyes. "That's the real estate company we pay rent to. What about it?" I smirked. "That company is mine. I own this apartment." My mother's mouth fell open. My father froze. Ethan stared at me like I had just said something impossible. "No way," my father growled. "You're lying." I pulled out my phone, opened a file and placed it on the table. "Here's the ownership contract. 4 years ago, when you were about to be evicted, I bought the mortgage. Since then, you've been paying rent to me without even knowing it." The truth hit them like a wrecking ball. My mother went pale, her voice trembling. You really did that?" I folded my arms. "You still think I'm a failure, don't you? Yet, you've been living off me for 4 years without realizing it." Ethan let out a sharp laugh, filled with mockery. "This is hilarious. Mum, Dad, you've been renting from her all this time." My father shot up from his seat, slamming his fists onto the table. "You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you have the right to humiliate us." I kept my expression unreadable. "Not at all. I just wanted you to know who you've been relying on." The silence stretched so long that I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. My mother blinked rapidly, trying to regain composure. "Isabella, if you own this apartment, then surely you can help us a little more, right? You could lower the rent." I stared at her. "No, Mum. You pay the full amount, or you leave." My father looked at me with pure hatred, but this time, I wasn't afraid. They thought they could keep using me forever. But now they realized they were standing on the edge of a cliff. And I was the one deciding their fate. The air in the room thickened, heavy as if a storm had just passed. I could see the panic in my mother's eyes, the fury on my father's face, and the dark amusement in Ethan's smirk. "You'll regret this, Isabella," my father growled, his voice dangerously low. I didn't react right away. I simply took another sip of water, keeping my tone calm. "Oh? And what exactly are you going to do? There's only one truth here. This apartment belongs to me, and you have no claim over it anymore." My father's knuckles turned white from how hard he was clenching his fists, but instead of yelling as he usually did, he took a deep breath, as if trying to restrain himself. "So what now?" he spat. "You're going to throw your own parents out on the street, the ones who raised you?" I let out a slow exhale. "Yes, you raised me, but that doesn't mean I owe you my entire life. You've always treated me like a burden, like a failure. But now? You're living in a home I own, and you still expect me to keep bailing you out?" My mother rushed in, her voice trembling. "Isabella, you can't do this. You know we have no money." I crossed my arms. "I know. And that's not my problem." Ethan chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Wow, you're really cold, huh? But you know what? You're just setting yourself up for trouble. No one kicks their own family out without consequences." I raised an eyebrow, locking eyes with him. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" Ethan shrugged, but his gaze was sharper than ever. "Just that. You should think carefully before making a move. Mum and Dad have a lot of friends, a lot of connections. If you push too hard, you won't like what happens next." I was quiet for a moment, then laughed. "Oh really? And what are they going to do? Spread rumors about me, or—" I tilted my head, locking eyes with my father. "Call my workplace and try to sabotage my career?" He flinched, just for a second. A flicker of worry flashed in his eyes before it was quickly replaced by anger. "Don't accuse me of things I haven't done," he snarled. I propped my elbows on the table, speaking slowly, deliberate. "I'm not accusing you. I know exactly what you've done. And let me tell you something. This morning I had a meeting with HR. I warned them that you might try to call and make false claims to ruin my reputation." My father's face darkened, my mother gasped, and Ethan's eyes widened in shock. "So Dad, if you're really thinking about it, I suggest you reconsider. My company has an excellent legal team, and if you take one wrong step, you'll be the one facing consequences." The room fell into dead silence. I could see my father's hands trembling with rage, but he had no escape. My mother started to cry. "Isabella, you're making everything worse. We're family. Family doesn't do this to each other." I sighed. "Real family doesn't treat me like garbage, Mum." She had nothing to say to that. I stood up, adjusting my coat. "You have 1 month. If you can't pay, you leave. The law is clear, and I'm not afraid to enforce it." My father's glare burned into me as he hissed, "You'll regret this, Isabella." I shrugged. "Maybe, but not today." I turned and walked out, leaving behind the shock, the hatred, and the helplessness in their eyes. They thought they could control me forever. But they were wrong. I wasn't the Isabella they once knew. And this time, I wasn't looking back. The voice on the other end of the line was formal, unmistakably that of a lawyer. "Good morning, Miss Carter. My name is James Holloway from Holloway & Associates law firm. I am representing Mr. and Mrs. Greg and Linda Carter in a legal matter concerning the ownership of the apartment they currently reside in." I leaned back in my chair, smirking. That was fast. "I see," I replied calmly. "And what exactly are they claiming?" "My clients believe there has been a misunderstanding regarding the mortgage contract. They were unaware that the ownership of the apartment had been transferred, and they would like to discuss the possibility of reclaiming the property." I let out a quiet chuckle. "A misunderstanding? They signed the contract 4 years ago. I have all the paperwork to prove it." "That is correct, Miss Carter," James Holloway said, maintaining his professional tone. "However, my clients are hoping to explore a negotiated resolution rather than proceeding with legal action." I shook my head. My parents never played fair. If they had gone to a lawyer, it meant they were trying to intimidate me. "There's no need for negotiations, Mr. Holloway," I said slowly. "My parents no longer have any claim to that apartment. If they wish to stay, they must pay their rent on time. If not, they can find somewhere else." He was silent for a few seconds, perhaps surprised by how firm I was. "So, you are completely rejecting their proposal?" "Completely." "I understand," he hesitated. "I will relay your response to my clients." I ended the call, exhaling deeply. They refused to accept reality. They still thought they could turn things around. But they didn't realize the game had ended the moment they turned their backs on me. 3 days passed in silence. No calls, no messages, no further moves from my parents. But I knew they weren't giving up. And I was right. On Wednesday morning, just as I stepped into the office, Lauren, the head of HR, called me into the conference room. "Isabella," she said, her expression serious, "we just received an anonymous call, accusing you of financial fraud within the company." I gripped the strap of my handbag, but my face remained calm. "Is that so?" I asked, my tone indifferent. Lauren nodded. "They claimed you had been embezzling money from the company's investments, that you were hiding income and evading taxes." I nearly laughed. My parents had really gone this far? "Lauren," I said, meeting her eyes directly, "I anticipated this." She raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" I pulled out my phone, opened my email, and scrolled down to the message I had sent to the legal department 3 days ago. I knew my father would try to ruin my reputation by any means. I informed the company in advance that they might attempt this. I placed my phone on the table for her to read. Lauren skimmed through the email, then sighed. "We've already investigated. Of course, there's no evidence to support their claims, but this proves they're willing to play dirty." I nodded, "And so am I." Lauren looked at me, slightly surprised by my response. "What do you plan to do?" I smiled. "Just let them get a taste of their own medicine." That evening, I sent a single message. To Uncle Ray. "Can you help me find some information?" From Uncle Ray. "About what?" To Uncle Ray. "About my parents' debts. How much do they owe, who did they borrow from, and how deep are they really in?" From Uncle Ray. "Isabella, I looked into it. Your parents are in over $60,000 of debt, with a high-interest lending firm. If they don't make payments in the next 2 months, they will be sued and could face asset seizures." To Uncle Ray. "Do you know where all that money went?" From Uncle Ray. "Mostly credit card debt, but a large chunk of it was transferred to Ethan, for a business investment that seems to have failed miserably." I smirked. Of course. Ethan had never succeeded at anything, but my parents had always been willing to pour money into his hands, clinging to the hope that one day he would become the pride of the family. And now they were drowning in debt just to protect his image. They had gambled everything on Ethan. And they lost. I didn't have to wait long to see their next move. On Saturday night, just as I arrived home, a knock echoed at my door. I glanced through the peephole. My mother. I opened the door. She stood there, her eyes red, her face gaunt compared to the last time I had seen her. The fake confidence was gone. All that was left was panic and desperation. "Isabella, please, I need to talk to you." I crossed my arms. "About what?" She placed a trembling hand on her chest, her voice unsteady. "Your father and we're in trouble. Things aren't how you think. We can't afford to pay the rent anymore. If you don't help, we'll lose everything." I leaned against the doorframe, my voice cold. "Didn't you hire a lawyer? Couldn't he help?" She shook her head. "That didn't work out. Isabella, you're the only one who can save us now." I looked at her, saying nothing. She swallowed hard and continued. "Your father, he won't say it, but he regrets everything. He never meant to hurt you, he just doesn't know how to express his emotions." I let out a quiet laugh. "He doesn't know how to express emotions? By calling me a mistake, a failure, and then trying to destroy my career? That's how he shows love?" My mother fell silent. I stared at her, my voice turning sharp. "You never cared about me, you only cared about what I could give you." She shook her head, tears spilling down her face. "That's not true, sweetheart, you're misunderstanding." "No," I cut her off. "I understand perfectly. My whole life I've been chasing your approval, but I was never good enough, and now, when you have nothing left, you come to me." My mother choked back a sob, her voice lowering. "What do you want for forgiveness? Just help us this one time and I promise we'll never bother you again." I crossed my arms, looking at her with nothing but disdain. "Forgiveness? Do you really think I could forget everything just because you're crying at my doorstep?" She trembled. "We're family, Isabella." I sighed. "Mum, family doesn't use each other. Family doesn't turn their backs just because someone doesn't meet their expectations. And family never tries to destroy each other's lives." She lowered her head, her shoulders shaking. I watched her for a few seconds, then opened the door wider. "If you truly want to make things right, here's how. Walk away, and never come back." She lifted her eyes to me, pain written all over her face, but I felt nothing. She gave a small nod, stepping back. I'm sorry." I didn't respond, I just stood there, watching as she turned and walked away. Then, I shut the door. And this time, I didn't feel guilty. 30 days later, I received an email confirmation from the property management company. From Everton Holdings. "We confirm that Greg and Linda Carter have vacated the apartment. They failed to make payments on time and their lease has been officially terminated. The property has now been transferred to a new owner." I stared at the words on my screen, then slowly leaned back in my chair. They were gone. No last-minute theatrics, no desperate pleas, they had truly disappeared from my life. I picked up my phone and dialed Uncle Ray. "Uncle Ray," I said when he answered. "We did it." He let out a deep sigh. "Are you okay?" I thought for a moment. Better than ever. And for the first time in my life, I truly believed it. 3 months had passed since I officially cut ties with my parents. 3 months since they were forced out of the apartment they once thought was theirs. 3 months of silence, no angry calls, no manipulative messages, no fake apologies. At first I thought I might feel empty. But I didn't. I felt free. No longer weighed down by the expectations of people who never truly loved me, no longer forced to endure their insults, their disappointment. I was finally untethered. On Monday morning, as I walked into my office, Mark, my financial advisor, was already waiting. He smiled as I sat down. "Isabella, congratulations." I raised an eyebrow. "For what?" He slid a folder across the table. "Your property sold for 15% more than the initial valuation. The profit from selling your parents' apartment not only reimburses your investment over the past 4 years, but also leaves you with a substantial surplus." I glanced at the numbers on the paperwork. A significant amount. Leaning back in my chair, I exhaled in relief. "Good, I want to allocate part of this to start a new project." Mark smiled knowingly. "The initiative you mentioned last time?" I nodded. "Yes. I want to establish a fund to help women escape financially abusive and toxic family situations." He looked at me with admiration. That's an incredible idea, Isabella, but are you sure? Are you really ready to commit to this? I met his gaze, unwavering. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. 7 years ago, I believed family was everything. I worked myself to the bone, sacrificed my personal life and chased success just to earn my father's approval. But now I understood. Family isn't about shared blood. It's about the people who stand by you, respect you and love you unconditionally. And I wanted to use my experiences to help others break free from the kind of control I had endured. 1 month later, I officially launched the Freedom Fund, a non-profit dedicated to helping women escape financial manipulation and toxic family dynamics. Young women came to me, women whose parents had controlled their finances, used them, manipulated them. Each one carried their own story. And for the first time I realized I wasn't alone. I hadn't just freed myself. I was helping others find their freedom too. 3 months after the fund's launch, a new message appeared in my inbox. From Mum. Isabella, I don't know where else to go. Can we talk? I stared at the message for a long time. 3 months ago, I might have hesitated. I might have wondered if I should give her another chance. But not now. I deleted the message. Some doors, once closed, should never be reopened. And I had no regrets. I used to think that when I finally broke free from my family, I would feel empty. That I would feel lost, that I would regret cutting ties. But the reality was different. When I pressed the delete button on my mother's message, I didn't feel heartache. I didn't feel regret. I only felt relief, the kind of relief I had craved for so many years. Throughout my childhood, I did everything I could to earn my parents' love. I thought that if I were good enough, successful enough, perfect enough, they would finally be proud of me. But the truth was, they never wanted me to win. They wanted me to stay within the lines they had drawn, a daughter who always bowed her head, always tried to prove her worth, always came back whenever they needed money. But I was no longer that weak girl. I had built my own life. I had found people who truly valued me, respected me, and stood by my side, without needing me to prove anything. I had chosen myself. And I had never felt stronger. 1 year later, the Freedom Fund grew beyond anything I had imagined. We had helped dozens of women escape toxic families, supported them in finding jobs, securing housing and rebuilding their lives. Free from the people who once tried to control them. One morning as I stood in my office, my assistant walked in. Isabella, someone's here to see you. I raised an eyebrow. Who? She hesitated. A man, he says he's your father. My heartbeat didn't quicken, I felt no anxiety. I simply sighed and shook my head. Tell him I'm not available. She nodded and left. I turned back to my computer screen and continued working. The past no longer had any power over me. I had spent my whole life seeking their approval. But in the end, the only approval I truly needed was my own. And now I had it. I had won. I was free. We don't get to choose the family we are born into, but we can choose how we live and who is worthy of being in our lives. Don't let anyone control you simply because of the word family. Your worth is not defined by their validation, but by what you have built for yourself. Learn to be financially independent, set firm boundaries, and never hesitate to cut off toxic relationships. In the end, family isn't about blood. It's about the people who truly love, respect, and stand by you unconditionally. What do you think about this story? Have you ever faced a similar situation, or know someone who has struggled with a toxic family? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to follow the channel so you won't miss more compelling stories about life and family.